Welcome to Heartstring Stories, the place where tales touch your soul, where emotions unfold, and where the most unexpected moments of kindness, love, and sacrifice take us to places beyond imagination. Every story here is a journey, a window into the fragile and powerful nature of the human heart. Today, you will hear a story that will make you question what true worth really means, what love can accomplish, and how sometimes the most overlooked person can hold the greatest power. "If you teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything," cried the CEO. But in the end, it wasn't a doctor, it wasn't a scientist, and it wasn't the money that made the miracle happen. It was the janitor who did it. The story begins in a towering skyscraper in the center of the city, where the most powerful man in the corporate world sat behind his vast mahogany desk, staring at the city lights that stretched endlessly before him. Richard Cole was his name, a CEO known not only for his unmatched wealth and power but also for his iron will. Yet, beneath the armor of success, Richard was a father, broken, desperate, and clinging to hope that seemed to slip further with each passing day. His daughter, Emily, once a bright and joyful child, had lost her voice after a terrible accident. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism, a silence so deep it couldn't be pierced by medicine or therapy. She hadn't spoken a word in 2 years. Every expert had tried. Speech therapists, neurologists, child psychologists, and even alternative healers had stepped into the mansion where Emily lived in silence. They had all left defeated, shaking their heads with polite apologies that felt like knives to Richard's heart. He could build empires, he could crush competition, he could buy anything, but he couldn't buy his daughter's voice. One evening, after yet another failed session, Richard slammed his hand against the wall and cried out in anguish. "If you teach her to speak again, I'll give you everything. Everything I own, everything I have, just bring my little girl back to me." His voice trembled, echoing through the hallways of the mansion. Unbeknownst to him, someone else heard his desperate plea. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't a specialist. It was Daniel, the janitor of the corporate tower Richard owned. Daniel was invisible to most of the staff, moving quietly through the halls, sweeping floors, emptying bins, fixing little things no one noticed until they broke. He lived simply, his clothes worn, his shoes scuffed, but his eyes carried warmth, a softness that came from years of both suffering and resilience. Daniel had a secret, one no one in the skyscraper would have imagined. He used to be a teacher of children with special needs, a man who had dedicated his life to helping the most vulnerable find their voices, until tragedy had struck his own family and left him drifting. When Daniel heard Richard's cry that night, something inside him stirred. The words weren't just desperation, they were a father's raw pain. Daniel thought of his own daughter, who he had lost years ago to illness, and how powerless he had felt. He knew pain. He knew silence. And he knew that sometimes, the smallest gestures could move mountains where all the world's wealth and power failed. The next morning, Daniel approached Richard with hesitation. He wasn't supposed to speak directly to the CEO, janitors kept their heads down. But he did it anyway. "Sir," he said softly, "I think I might be able to help your daughter." Richard, exhausted and bitter, almost laughed. You? You clean floors. Do you have any idea how many world-class doctors have failed? Do you think I need a broom and a mop to fix my child?" His words were sharp, but Daniel didn't flinch. He simply said, "Sometimes the heart listens when the mind cannot. Let me try." Something about Daniel's calm, unshaken tone made Richard pause. Against his better judgment, against all logic, he agreed. "Fine. You get one chance. If you can make her speak again, everything I own is yours." So Daniel began visiting Emily every afternoon. He didn't bring medical equipment, charts, or therapy manuals. Instead, he brought kindness. He brought music. He brought stories. He sat on the carpeted floor of her room, while Emily sat silently, clutching her stuffed bear, her eyes distant and wary. Daniel didn't demand words from her. He didn't ask her to speak. He simply shared. He told her about the time he got stuck in a tree trying to rescue a cat. He drew silly pictures on scraps of paper. He played a harmonica, the notes clumsy but cheerful. He even showed her magic tricks with coins, making them vanish and reappear behind her ear. At first, Emily sat in silence, staring, almost unresponsive. But slowly, the corners of her lips twitched, the tiniest sparks of a smile forming. Day after day, Daniel came back. He didn't push, he didn't force, he simply created a safe world where laughter could exist again. He knew that healing begins not with pressure, but with trust. One afternoon, he brought out an old puppet. It was ragged, with one button eye missing, but he made it dance, stumble, and talk in a funny voice. Emily's shoulders shook as she let out the faintest giggle, sound, real sound, breaking through her silence for the first time. Richard, who had been watching from the doorway, felt tears stream down his face. Weeks passed, and Emily began humming when Daniel played his harmonica. She whispered when she thought no one was listening. Then came the day that changed everything. Daniel was pretending to be the puppet again, asking silly questions in its squeaky voice, when suddenly Emily answered. Just one word, small and fragile, yes. The puppet froze in Daniel's hand. He blinked, heart pounding. Richard, who had been sitting silently in the corner, gasped so loudly Emily turned to look at him. Say it again, sweetheart, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. Emily's lips quivered, and then, with a shaky breath, she said, yes. The room exploded in tears. Richard ran to her, kneeling, holding her hands, crying into her hair. His daughter had spoken. She had broken the silence. And it wasn't medicine. It wasn't wealth. It was love, patience, and the persistence of a man the world had overlooked. Richard turned to Daniel, his face wet with tears. You did it. You did what no one else could. Everything I own, it's yours. His voice cracked, his promise sincere. But Daniel shook his head. I don't want your money, sir. I don't need your wealth. All I wanted was to give her back her voice. That's enough. Richard was stunned. For a man who had lived his life buying everything, Daniel's refusal was something he couldn't comprehend. Why? Why would you refuse everything I have? Daniel smiled sadly. Because I know what it feels like to lose a child's voice forever. I couldn't save mine, but I could help you save yours. That is worth more than all the riches in the world. From that day on, Daniel was no longer invisible. He became part of their lives, not as a janitor, but as family. Emily adored him, and Richard respected him more than any partner or executive he had ever known. The skyscraper's CEO learned a truth that day. Some treasures cannot be bought, only given freely from one heart to another. And so, the story of a desperate father, a silent child, and a humble janitor became a reminder to everyone who heard it. Miracles don't always come from power or wealth, but from compassion, patience, and the courage to believe in the impossible. This is Heartstring Stories, and if this story touched you, remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we overlook, the ones sweeping quietly in the background, waiting for the chance to remind us of what truly matters.